Hello! Today I'm going to start by reading a short selection from my book, Ghostographs, which is inspired by the vintage photographs I have collected over the years. So it is sort of interconnected, very short flash fiction, each accompanied by a photograph, and the overall thing tells the whole story. So I'm going to start with The Woman Across the Way. The woman across the way. Underneath her skin there were snakes. I saw them once, writhing along the backs of her hands. My mother made too many muffins, so she sent me with a tin to give to the woman across the way. We'd never seen her, but we heard she lived alone. The snakes were thin and greenish blue, and I know what you were going to say. Those were veins, you are going to say. Silly child, don't you know what veins are? But I tell you they were snakes. I tell you that as I handed her the tin, my hand brushed against the back of her hand, and I felt the prick of their teeth, needle-sharp, on my palm. At the county fair that year, she had a quilt up for raffle. It was made of scraps no bigger than postage stamps. Everybody marveled at how a woman so old could make stitches so fine and straight and small. But I knew how. She had the snakes sewed with their teeth. I bought 4 tickets for the raffle, but I didn't win. In the baking contest, my mother's muffins got 3rd place. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and read My Great Aunts. My great aunts. I had more of them than was strictly necessary. Everybody said so. True, Aunt Ruth brought bags of saltwater taffy back for my little sister and me every time she went on one of her trips to the seaside. And yes, Aunt Cecily gave excellent life advice. And sure, I will always remember with fondness the day Aunt Edna took me out in the woods and showed me where the bodies were buried. But it took a toll, too. I had trouble keeping track of them all, trouble remembering which took cream in her coffee and which took whiskey. They did not take kindly to being forgotten. It was imperative that my sister and I send every one of them handmade and heartfelt cards on their birthdays and on the anniversaries of their weddings and on the anniversaries of their husbands' deaths. They pinched our cheeks until we bruised. They shamed us for our untied shoes. They knitted us hideous sweaters, which itched worse than anything. They loved us, certainly, but not like their own, more like dolls or tiny dogs. And then I will finish up with dolls or tiny dogs. Dolls or tiny dogs. Aunt Cecily had quite a lot of both. You walked into her house and it was nothing but eyes, looking up at you from the floor, looking down at you from the shelves on the walls. And Aunt Cecily's own set, of course, somewhere in the middle of it all. We assumed the dolls were haunted. We could see no purpose for them otherwise. But they never once moved on their own, even when we turned our backs specifically to trick them into it. It was the tiny dogs that were haunted. Not all of them, but a few. There was a miniature schnauzer that was haunted by the ghost of Aunt Cecily's first husband. This dog was her least favorite, to hear her tell it, but she let it watch the television all day long and fed it cigars with mustard on rye. My favorite was a terrier haunted by the ghost of a Great Dane. That dog barely came up to my knees, but you could tell that, in its heart, it towered over all of us. I wanted that dog for my own. Once, Aunt Cecily let my little sister pick out any doll she wanted from the whole house. I hoped she'd let me do the same with the dogs, but instead one day she offered me a doll, too. I said, what in the world would I want with a doll? Aunt Cecily said, child, if you live long enough, you will learn the value of a set of eyes that do not watch you, and a pair of lips that never speak. So I picked out a small porcelain doll with a chip missing from her cheek. I put her on the shelf in my room, and I never bothered her, and she never bothered me either. That's Ghostographs. And then I'm also going to read a short selection from my novel, Some Kind of Animal. And this isn't the very beginning, so chapter 4 actually, but I think it serves as a decent introduction. The last time anyone in town saw my mother alive was at the Country Lanes bowling alley in Needle. She sat in a booth eating onion rings, silent, her belly huge, while Logan Cantrell and his younger brother Brandon bowled frame after frame. About a week later, Brandon showed up before the sun and banged on Grandma Margaret's front door. When she answered, he shoved a bundle wrapped in a hunting jacket into her arms and ran off. That bundle was me. My sister Lee and I are twins. We look enough alike that when I peered out my window one night 10 years ago and saw her standing at the edge of Grandma Margaret's yard, wearing an oversized t-shirt as a dress, legs all mud to the knees, I knew right away that she was my sister. I was 5. I'd believed up until that moment that I was an only child. But at 5, the world was endlessly surprising, my picture of reality pliable as Play-Doh, in a way I'd already been expecting something like this to happen, for someone to show up out of the blue and change everything. Except I thought it would be my mother, coming back to get me. Sure, Grandma Margaret told me that Mama had gone to Jesus, or if she'd been drinking, gone to hell, but I believed back then that if I just wanted it hard enough, she might come back for me anyway. When I first saw my sister, I thought about running to the bottom of the staircase, calling for Aggie or Grandma Margaret, but I was afraid that if I took my eyes off my sister, she would disappear. So instead, I stood on the bed, unlatched the window, and climbed out. It was summer, and the ground felt cool beneath my feet. Crickets thrummed, fireflies floated up from the grass like shooting stars in reverse. My sister stood very still, watching me as I walked towards her. She didn't smile, didn't respond to my hi. When I reached out to touch her, she flinched. I asked her 1,000 questions that first night. Where did she come from? What was her name? Was her favorite color the same as mine? She didn't answer, just stared at me, and I worried that maybe she couldn't talk. But when I asked if she was hungry, she said yes. And when I asked if she wanted to come inside, she said no. And when I asked if I should go get Aggie to make us some food, her eyes went very wide and she turned around and ran back into the woods. The next night, I climbed out my window again and I waited at the edge of the yard, and sure enough, she came back. I gave her half a bag of Skittles I had saved for her, and she took my hand and led me into the trees. I didn't think it was so strange at first to have a secret sister. I'd sneak out at night, spend a few hours with her, sneak back in. Sometimes I'd bring toys out to the forest. Sometimes we'd just chase each other or play hide and seek. When Aggie and Margaret noticed the scratches on my legs, the mud between my toes, they thought I was sleepwalking. They bolted guardrails to my bed, fed me hot milk with whiskey. When I said I had a sister, they told me not to be silly. When I said, no, really, I do, she comes to see me at night, Aggie told me not to talk about sisters to her, that I didn't know what it felt like to have your heart ripped in two, and I was lucky I never would. Grandma Margaret told me lying was a sin, and did I know what happened to sinners? I did, of course, because she told me every chance she got. God struck them down in their tracks and sent them straight to hell. Do you know how hot it gets in hell? She asked me once. When I shrugged, she took me by the wrist and dragged me to the kitchen. She switched on one of the stovetop gas burners and pulled my hand closer and closer until I felt the heat, until the edges of the flames licked my fingers and I shrieked and Aggie came running from the other room. Two of them shouted at each other and I slunk away to my bedroom and pressed my throbbing fingers to the cold glass of the window by my bed, wishing my sister would come and take me away. Eventually I realized, it is strange. She is strange. Nearly everyone in town knows the story of Brandon bringing me to Grandma Margaret. They differ on the specifics: dawn, midnight, his coat covered in blood or not a drop of blood on him, a wicked smile on his face or a look of terror. But nobody has ever said a thing about another baby. On this detail, everyone agrees. Brandon brought one bundle that day. One baby. And I think I will stop there. So that is Some Kind of Animal, my novel, and Ghost of Grass, my collection of short fiction. All right. Thank you very much for listening.